Well, good evening. It is good to be here with you back for Bible study once again. We are continuing on in this series on the historical survey of the Old Testament. And this evening, we are finishing up the reign of King David and are going through the time of King Solomon. And we'll cover that this evening. This is a particularly noteworthy time in biblical history because it sets the stage for so many things that came afterward. We covered most of David's reign last time and certainly saw a number of lessons that came out from family circumstances in the family of David. It was really during King Solomon's reign that Israel reached her height and was for a brief time a light to the Gentiles, which is what God had intended Israel to be. And we will note a little bit of the worldwide impact that King Solomon had. We'll get into some of that as we go through the Bible study. But the Scripture tells us, of course, that Solomon's kingdom, his empire, stretched all the way from the Euphrates River to what the Bible terms the River of Egypt, the Egyptian border. He had a naval base at Eilat, which is actually where there's a big Israeli base there at Eilat, that naval port. This is right down, as you look on a Bible map, right at the top of the Red Sea, or what goes in the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the top of the Red Sea. The Red Sea, of course, as you look on a map, is what separates Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. And it starts up here at the top and comes on down, and there is what is the Horn of Africa, as it's called, Ethiopia, Eritrea, that comes out right there and almost meets the Arabian Peninsula, where Aden is down at the bottom of the Red Sea, and from there, of course, going on out into the Indian Ocean, having the east coast of Africa as well as, of course, the areas of what we term the Persian Gulf and on over to India. Solomon's, this big naval base that was there, it's interesting that just a matter of about 2 or 3 miles away from there was the city of Ezion-Geber, which has been called by archaeologists the Pittsburgh of the ancient world. The largest smelting furnace that has ever been discovered in terms of let's say, ancient times, antiquity, was located at Ezion-Geber. There were iron and copper mines nearby. So it was there have been some interesting articles written on that back a number of years ago. It was excavated back years back, and some interesting things dating, of course, from the time of King Solomon. So we see that here was the basis of major commercial activity. And if you look at a map, one of the things you find is that the kingdom of Solomon sat right atop the major trade routes of the ancient world. Both when you look at that area stretching from the northern Euphrates on over to the coast, you have both sea routes and caravan trade, and realize that there was down in the southern Arabian Peninsula was noted in what would today be Aden and Yemen. That area was noted for spices, for things like incense, frankincense, and for various spices that were utilized. These things played a major role in ancient times. And as we're going to see as we go through the account, clearly Solomon's ships went far afield. The sailors that he used were Phoenician sailors, loaned him by Hiram of Tyre. They are called in the Scripture servants of Hiram of Tyre. Well, Tyre was the great Phoenician capital. Later on, after the days of Solomon, the Phoenicians started a colony in North Africa called Carthage. And ultimately, Carthage came to dwarf Tyre, which was its mother city. Carthage was a colony of Tyre originally. And that, of course, played a role. Carthage played a major role in later history, Roman history of and Mediterranean history. But the Phoenicians were noted for their sailing abilities. There have been, in recent decades, there have been several archaeological discoveries in the American continents, in basically North America, Mexico, on up to there's one in Minnesota. There's another up in New England of stone monuments that have Phoenician inscriptions in the Punic language, Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenicians used an alphabet, basically the same alphabet that the Hebrew uses, and they were very noted as sailors, and clearly in antiquity had traversed the Atlantic Ocean on any number of times. So they were excellent sailors. They are some of the ones. They're tin mines up in Cornwall in the British Isles in England. There is record of Phoenician activity there in terms of coins and things of that sort. That clearly the Phoenician traders were involved in some of that. Well, what the time of King Solomon represented a time really when it was utilizing Phoenician sailors and some of the Phoenician technology, but the Navy was financed by Solomon, and really it was the time of Israel's height. It was a combination. It was of let's say Solomon's guidance and oversight on some of this, and utilizing the Phoenician sailors and some of the technology that they had developed. That clearly had a worldwide impact, and that, again, as we see in there, the wealth, prosperity, peace, all of these things were part of the legacy of King Solomon's kingdom. His name, Solomon, is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. And after all the wars of David, Solomon inherited a peaceful kingdom. And in many ways, his kingdom was a type of tomorrow's world. The reference in Kings to the fact that in the days of Solomon, every man sat under his own vine and his own fig tree there in Israel is a quotation that is used back in the prophets referring to the world tomorrow. That it is a descriptive term of people at peace, people having their property. God uses inspired several places in the description of Solomon's reign to include references that really tie it in and connect it with the world tomorrow. As we get into this, we pick up right here at the conclusion of King David's reign. And what we find here, we'll start in 2 Samuel, and then we will tie it back in with, we'll notice the Chronicles account. Chronicles overlaps and includes some details that are otherwise left out. The chapter 23 gives the last words of David. Interesting the way he's described. These are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, says, the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of God, of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. So, this is the way that he is described. And much of this message is really directed to Solomon. These parting words of advice. Verse 3, the God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning when the sun rises, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after the rain. It's an interesting description of leadership. What is involved in being a good ruler, a good leader? Well, first and foremost, he that rules over men must be just. You look up that term, and it basically means fair and equitable. It has to do with doing what's right, with treating people properly. One of the worst things to undermine respect for leaders is when they engage in a double standard. And that turns people off, and it alienates people. Certainly it has very pronounced effect on young people. Kids are very quick to pick up on things that are unfair and double standards. And so a starting point, the two things that it brings out first is be just, be fair, ruling in the fear of God. That you are conscious of God's oversight. You're conscious of God's presence. If we're ruling in the fear of God, and you can apply that principle in anything from the home to the job to the church to any context you want to. The point is that we are living our lives before God. And so we're conscious of God's oversight as we deal with other people. Now, if a person is fair and is deeply conscious of God's presence and oversight, then it talks about a good leader, he'll be as the light of the morning when the sun rises. And it describes here how the tender grass springs up, after the rain, rains and the sun comes out. And it's a welcome sight. Now, the sun coming out on a day like this is something that's very welcoming, and it is something that let's say promotes growth. That's the example Solomon used. It rains and then the sun comes out on a clear day, and you find the green things beginning to sprout, beginning to come up. That it's as though that warm sunlight draws out growth. Well, a good leader ought to have the impact on his kingdom or on his family or on his employees of being like the sunlight, drawing out growth. And it describes that. Then he went on in talking about as other things, goes on talking about some of the mighty men of David and some of these various things. Now let's notice in chapter 24. The anger of the Eternal was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go, number Israel and Judah. Now who said, go, number Israel and Judah? Who moved David to do that? Well, if you just hold your spot right here, and we go back to Chronicles, the end of 1 Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, we find in verse 1 that Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. So what's not made plain in Samuel's account is clarified here in 1 Chronicles, and that is that Satan was the one who instigated David to do this. And David told Joab and the rulers of the people to go number Israel from Beersheba to Dan. Bring me the numbers of them that I may know. And Joab didn't want to do that. And toward the end of the chapter, or the end of verse 3, he says, "Why then does my Lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of trespass in Israel?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. So Joab departed and went throughout Israel and came to Jerusalem. Now, what we find as we come on down, what he took a census of was the kind of army he could put forth. Verse 5, Joab gave the sum of the number of the people unto David, and all they of Israel were over 1,000,000 men, 1,100,000 men that drew the sword. And Judah was 470,000 men that drew the sword. So what David was trying to put together was to figure out what size army he could field. Now, when you tie it in with secular history, you realize that there were some activities going on east of the Euphrates, and David was beginning to focus in and looking at putting this big army together and how big an army could he put together, and it was a wrong focus. He was getting his attention on trying to build up some powerful force and go out and deal with these things in a way that God wanted him to put his trust and his confidence in God, and not to be focusing in on counting up his men and all what he could do and sort of figuring it in a way that he shouldn't have been. Satan stirred him up on this, and it was a matter that David became apprehensive because of certain events that were going on in the world around him, and he began to think purely in terms of a physical solution. This was actually not a totally complete census. Benjamin and Levi hadn't yet been counted. We're told in the end of verse 6, "For the king's word was abominable to Joab." Joab was a hard-headed fella, and it created some problems, but he was a person that also had a great deal of insight and wisdom on some things, and he knew this was not a good idea, knew it was not something that ought to be done. Told David that. David insisted, and so Joab sort of dragged his feet. He just really didn't have his heart in it. Well, God was displeased with this thing, and God was very displeased, and he smote Israel. And David said unto God, verse 8, "I've sinned greatly, because I've done this thing. Now I beseech you, do away the iniquity of your servant. I've done foolishly." And God sent word to David and told Gad the prophet to tell David, "Thus says the Eternal, I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them." And what he offered was a choice, verse 12, of either 3 years' famine, or 3 months to be destroyed before your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or 3 days the sword of the Lord, even the pestilence in the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the coast of Israel. Now, which do you want? Well, David told Gad, verse 13, "I'm in a great strait." That's a hard choice. "Let me now fall into the hands of the Lord, for very great are his mercies, but let me not fall into the hand of man." So it's interesting, David thought it through. He said, well, if famine comes, I'm going to get off more lightly. The wealthy are going to obviously fare better than everybody else. That's, David, and I'm going to be and the least affected by that of anybody in the kingdom, and everybody, all the wealthy, are going to be the least affected, and the poor are going to be the most affected. So David was just. You see, he wanted. He looked at fairness, and he says, "Don't want that." Now, the enemy coming in and attacking, or God sending a plague. He said, I'd rather be in God's hands than man's hands. You're a lot more likely to find mercy from God than you are mercy from people. I think I'd rather take my chances with God's plague. And so the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel. Verse 14, there fell of Israel 70,000 men. And God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it. Now, as he was destroying, the Eternal beheld, and he repented him of the evil. This is what the expression is, and a very similar expression is used back in 2 Samuel 24:16. The angel of the stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it, and the Lord repented him of the evil, and told the angel that had destroyed the people, it is enough. Stay now your hand. Now, the term repent does not carry the connotation here. It's not a matter that God had made a terrible mistake and he repented of it. It was not a matter of God repenting of sin. God turned away from what was being done. God had mercy. God looked down and had regret or had compassion on the people. And that's the Hebrew word translated repent here is the Hebrew word naham, which means literally to be sorry or to pity. Evil comes from a Hebrew word ra'ah, which means adversity, calamity, or affliction. In other words, God looked down on his people and he was moved with pity, with compassion at the affliction that they had. And things stopped right here. The angel of the Lord stood, we're told, by the threshing floor of Arnon the Jebusite. Now, it is a very interesting term that is described right here in 1 Chronicles, that David had lifted up his eyes, verse 16 of 1 Chronicles 21, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, having a drawn sword in his hand stretched out over Jerusalem. And David and the elders of Israel who were clothed in sackcloth fell on their faces. You better believe this is a pretty scary sight. As you put both accounts together, you find out David and these leading elders had left Jerusalem, were evidently on their way to the tabernacle, and they got out of the gates of Jerusalem and they looked up, and here was this angel with a drawn sword. Now, you talk about a scary sight. You see an angel with a drawn sword, and they fell on their face before God. And David said unto God, as he looked up and he saw this angel right here approaching Jerusalem, and he said unto God, is it not I that commanded the people to be numbered? Even I it is that have sinned and done evil indeed. As for these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray you, O Lord my God, be on me and on my father's house, but not on your people, that they should be plagued. And God stopped the angel here at this point. And the angel is right over the threshing floor of Ornan, which is outside of the old Jebusite citadel of Jerusalem, the city of David. But it is the area that we now know as the Temple Mount. You see, this is the source of why the Jews didn't consider building a temple anywhere else. God picked the place. The angel told Gad to tell David that he should go up and set up an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And now Ornan and his sons were out here and they were threshing. And Ornan looked up, and as you had the account that that was given back earlier, where Ornan looked up and he saw the angel, verse 20, and of 1 Chronicles 21. His 4 sons with him hid themselves, and Ornan was threshing wheat. And so they looked up and they saw the angel, and the sons took off. Boy, all of a sudden they were gone. They were out of there. They weren't going to stick around. And Ornan saw David, and he as David came there to Ornan, he went out of the threshing floor and bowed himself down, very respectful to the king. And David asked him, he said, I would like the place of this threshing floor to build an altar here to God. And Ornan told the king, well, I'll just give it to you. You can have it. And the king said, no, I can't take something that doesn't cost me anything and give it as a gift to God. I mean, that was the concept, you see. If David was going to, if David was going to present something to God, it had to cost David something. And he wanted to pay for it. And so this was the spot. So God, in that sense, had selected the spot. The angel stopped holding his sword up, and so David paid Ornan quite a sizable amount of gold. Verse 25, built an altar. Verse 26, and put the offerings there. And the Lord answered from heaven by fire upon the altar of burnt offering. And then the Lord commanded the angel, and he put the sword into the sheath. Boy, don't you know that was a welcome relief. You go through all this thing, you set up the altar, lay out the animals, and all of a sudden this big swoosh of fire comes down from heaven and consumes the animals. And you look up, and this angel that has a drawn sword now takes the sword down and puts it in his sheath. I mean, it's hard to even imagine what it must have been like to have seen something like that. So from this point on, it was clear as to where the temple was going to be built. David, you remember, who wanted and had a desire to build a temple to God. And so verse 28, at that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him in the threshing floor of Ornan, that he sacrificed there. The tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering, they were at that season in the high place at Gibeon. And David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid because of the sword of the angel of the Lord. He had evidently started out on his way to Gibeon, saw this, and stopped right there. He didn't have time to go on to Gibeon. He besought God right there. And this is David now says in chapter 22, verse 1, this is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of the burnt offering for Israel. And so he began to prepare for the temple. This was clearly the place where God had set his name. It's interesting the times that God answered by fire in the Old Testament. The first, when the tabernacle was reared up in the wilderness, and they dedicated the tabernacle to God, and they laid out the offerings on the altar, God answered by fire. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the offering. Later on, you find here, in selecting the location of where the temple was to be, ending this period of crisis, of judgment, God sent fire down, and that answered, that was God's response. When the Temple of Solomon was dedicated, God, again, the offering on the altar was kindled by by divine fire. It's interesting, there are other, let's say, private examples. You remember, of course, Elijah, when God answered by fire in those days, who's God or Baal. There are a couple of other examples of divine intervention. Once back in the days of Abraham, and once I think in the case of sacrifice that Samson's parents offered, or at least there was the angel there ascended up from that sacrifice in the fire. It was unique. The one time when there was not divine fire, and this is just sort of an interesting aside, when the second temple was built in the days of Zerubbabel, and it was dedicated, there is no record in the Scripture of divine fire being kindled. And Jewish tradition mentions specifically that one of the things, certain things that were lacking with the second temple, one of the things it mentions was the divine fire. It's interesting because at the time that happened, and you can imagine, in one sense, the level of disappointment. The people could read about when the tabernacle was reared up, and the presence of God filled the tabernacle so that the priest couldn't come in, the Shekinah glory, and the divine fire came from heaven on the altar. When Solomon's temple was dedicated, same thing. Shekinah glory filled the temple, and the divine fire came from heaven and kindled the sacrifice. When the second temple was built in the days of Zerubbabel, they just had to, light the wood up the way they normally did. There was no Shekinah glory filling the temple. There was no divine fire. You can, imagine putting yourself there, the sense of sort of letdown or disappointment that people must have felt. This temple, of course, was much smaller and not nearly as grand as the Temple of Solomon. And it's interesting because the prophet Haggai told them, he was the prophet at the time, that the glory of this latter temple will be greater than the glory of the first. Well, what gave the first temple, it was grand, and it had the presence of God there in a very unique way. But the glory of the second temple was greater because you see the second temple, God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, came there. He came into that temple and was physically, personally present and brought into that temple a glory that superseded anything else because the literal presence of the God of Israel was right there. And it's interesting because it set the stage. The first temple had its glory when it was dedicated. The second temple had its glory not at the beginning, but toward the end, when the God of Israel literally came and walked up and down and taught the good news of the kingdom of God, laid out the plan and the purpose of God in a way that not even the doctors of the law had ever been able to comprehend and put together that way. So it's interesting. I go into a little detail on it because I think it's good for us to understand that God doesn't always do things exactly the same way. In other words, God has a plan and a purpose that He's working out. And there are times when God may do things in a certain dramatic way, and He may have reasons for not doing something in the same dramatic way in another set of circumstances. And it's an interesting lesson for us to learn. Did God accept the second temple and place His presence there? Yes, He did. But we find the Messiah coming into that second temple, and that gets into another story. But it is, I think, good to look at. So David began all this preparation for the temple and all of the things that were involved. Now, 1 Chronicles 23:1 tells us, when David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. This was common in the house of David. That is, that often a new king was coronated while the old king was still alive. That is one of the, gets into a technical matter in terms of some of the so-called chronological difficulties in the Old Testament. If you go through, let me just state it simply. If you go through and you take the lengths of the reign of all the kings of Israel and you add them up, and you take the length of the reign of all the kings of Judah and add them up, from the time of Solomon's death on down until the destruction of Israel, because it dates, you see, dates the last king of Israel to the king of Judah, the contemporary king. If you go down that far and you add up the number of years, you come up with two different figures. You find that the length for the Jewish kings is longer than the length of the kings of Israel. And you scratch your head and say, well, how was that? We've started at the same point, we've ended at the same point. Well, the answer is as to how they counted the reigns of the kings. And what we find was a common practice in Judah was that there was often an overlap that a new king would be coronated during the lifetime of his predecessor. And David started that here, and I think clearly the matter was Solomon was young. We don't know exactly. I don't know that it can be determined exactly, but I think he must have certainly been a teenager. I don't think he was, not 12 or 13, but certainly on up, but certainly not out of his teens, because you have to. His mother was Bathsheba, and Solomon's birth was, let's say, approximately 2 years after David's adultery with Bathsheba, because there was a child that was born first, and that child died, and then Bathsheba conceived again, and Solomon was born. So you're dating, let's say, the incident with David and Bathsheba as being about 2 years before the birth of Solomon. And just as you go through the time of King David's reign, I don't see much way that Solomon could have been out of his teens by this time. Perhaps 16, 17, maybe even 18, somewhere in that range. David had older children by previous wives, and yet it was God's purpose that Solomon be his successor. And David knew that there was possibility of intrigue, and there was already problems that were stirring up. The account tells us back in 1Kings, you see that one of David's sons, Adonijah, when David was on his deathbed and it was apparent that David couldn't live much longer, Adonijah decided that he ought to be the successor. He ought to be the new king. And there were those who didn't think Solomon ought to be the king because he was young and Adonijah was older, and people had this thing figured out. And so it was a problem. And Joab had thought this was a good idea. Adonijah ought to be king, and he didn't. He was in agreement with this. Part of the problem, Adonijah exalted himself. We're told in 1 Kings 1 verse 5, saying, "I'll be king." He thought he was the one who ought to be king. Verse 6, here's part of the problem. His father had not displeased him at any time in saying, "Why have you done so?" He was a very goodly man. His mother bore him after Absalom. So now you come to part of the rest of the story. This was Absalom's full brother. See, Absalom was the one who was the older son. He was the one who initially was the crown prince. Adonijah figured he, ought to be now. Absalom, of course, was dead. But we find that his father had not displeased him at any time, saying, "Why have you done so?" David never really called him to account. He was, so what do you think Adonijah was? Well, he was a spoiled brat. He was used to having his own way and never had to really account for anything. And, sometimes parents, I think this has often been the case with fathers who maybe feel guilty about a certain neglect that they have given their kids, will, in a sense, try to overcompensate by giving them things, by doing things to try to make up to them. And David had evidently just pretty well let him do what he wanted to do. Well, this matter came to a head. Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba came to David and said, "Look, God chose Solomon. You've said Solomon was going to be king. Adonijah is already, he's getting himself crowned. He's, they know you're not going to live much longer, and he's getting everything set up. He's going to be the king, and you're going to have to do something very quickly." So this is the point at which David had Solomon crowned. There was a public ceremony, and Solomon was crowned, and this sort of nipped this thing with Adonijah in the head. It was not an armed rebellion in the sense of what Absalom had done, but it was more in the level of political intrigue for who was going to be king after David died. And, just this sort of political maneuvering that began to take place. Rather than simply trusting God, see, God had already revealed through the prophet who it was to be. But Joab and some of the others looked at it. Of course, Adonijah wanted to be king, and some of the others looked at it. And from their standpoint, humanly, well, we're better with an older man. Adonijah was maybe, I think he was probably born during the years that David was in Hebron, so that would have made him a little over 30. He was somewhere around the age of 30, where Solomon, on the other hand, was maybe 17 or 18. And they looked at it and said, "Well, Solomon's too young, and I know, he's David's favorite, and he wants him to be king, and all this, but we think we know better." That's often what leads into political maneuvering. People are convinced that they've got the right idea. So it led into difficulties and problems, and we find that Solomon was publicly crowned, and this was to resolve the matter. Now, what you find in the latter part of 1 Chronicles are the things that David did to prepare for the temple. Chapter 22 tells of all of these things that were to be done. And we're told in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 17, David also commanded all the princes of Israel to help Solomon his son, saying, "Is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not given you rest on every side? For he has given the inhabitants of the land into my hands, and the land is subdued before the Lord and before his people. Set your heart and your soul to seek the Lord your God. Arise therefore and build the sanctuary of the Lord God, to bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the holy vessels of God into the house that is built to the name of the Lord." So David was old, full of days, made Solomon his son king. And David spent this latter portion of his life, maybe a matter of weeks or months, organizing things, organizing the priests and Levites into courses, getting things organized for the setting the stage for the temple. And this was really the uppermost thing on David's mind here at the end. He was really concerned, and he wanted it to glorify God. And he was very, very conscious of that. And so he was very conscious of what Solomon was to was to do. He wanted, and God then David instructed Solomon here in 1 Chronicles 29:9. You, Solomon, my son, know you the God of your father, and serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the imaginations of the thoughts. If you seek him, he'll be found of you, but if you forsake him, he'll cast you off forever. Take heed now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Be strong and do it. A lot of things may come along to distract you, but this is an interesting phrase. We're to serve God with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. Perfect heart has to do with complete sincerity, being very sincere, with a willing mind, doing it not begrudgingly. You can be very careful in what you do and still not do it in a willing mind. You might do it because you feel like you have to. That is an interesting point, of course, for all of us. Now, David organized things, and as we pick up the account here in 2 Chronicles, is Solomon and all the congregation, 2 Chronicles 1:3, Solomon and all the congregation went to the high place at Gibeon. That's where the tabernacle of the congregation was. David had brought up from Kirjath Jearim and had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. But they went to Gibeon, to the altar of sacrifice where the tabernacle was. And Solomon went to the brazen altar before the Lord, and he offered, verse 6, 1,000 burnt offerings upon it. And in that night, this is as Solomon comes to take the office of king after the death of his father. God appeared to Solomon, and he said, "Ask what I should give you. What would you like?" And Solomon asked for wisdom. This was the thing that he wanted. Verse 10, "Give me now wisdom and knowledge, that I may go out and come in before this people. For who can judge this your people, which is so great?" And God said to Solomon, "Because this was in your heart, you asked not for riches, wealth, or honor, nor the life of your enemies. Neither have you asked for long life, but you've asked wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may judge the people." So verse 12, "Wisdom and knowledge is granted unto you, and I'll give you riches and wealth and honor, such as none of the kings have had before you, neither shall there be any after you." Kings brings out that God told him, "If you will walk in my ways, I'll give you long life." That was the rest of that parallel account is given back in 1 Kings chapter 3. So he told him in 1 Kings 3:14, "If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David did, then I will lengthen your days." Solomon clearly did not live to be elderly by any circumstances. He reigned for 40 years, which is a long time till you consider that he was in his late teens when somewhere around there, undoubtedly less than 20 when he came to the throne. So he was less than 60 when he died. And I think most of us in this room would consider the 50s as being relatively young, as opposed to, we wouldn't consider Solomon elderly by any circumstances. But God was pleased with his desire for wisdom. And God gave Solomon great wisdom and insight. Solomon had a remarkable mind in terms of the ability to collect facts, to analyze those facts, to draw conclusions from them, to apply them to circumstances. We'll read here of how Solomon studied everything. He was, I guess the term would be He was a Renaissance man before the Renaissance. He was an individual who had a wide variety of interests. He was involved in agriculture, and he was involved in architecture, and he was interested in plants and animals, and studied just any number of subjects. He was a remarkable individual, and God gave him great insight in applying principles. But what we find is that as the years went by, and Solomon got his attention, his affection elsewhere, he became increasingly foolish in his actions. He allowed himself to be governed by the pulls of the flesh, and wound up, showing how foolish a wise man could act. And you have to conclude that Solomon turned out to do that. As we come on down through the account, that we maybe follow it through here in Kings, and we're told, we'll sort of go back and forth because one will add in a detail that the other does not. And as we come on down here in 1 Kings 4, in verse 20, it says, Israel and Judah were many, as the sand which is by the sea, in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. So, Solomon's reign early on, the people were happy. Now, by the time Solomon died, the people weren't happy. They were griping and complaining about the taxes, and it was just, the things were sort of a seething cauldron here, that once Solomon was gone, it was just ready to pop. But it didn't start out that way. The people multiplied. They were prosperous. They had plenty. They were eating and drinking, making merry. Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river, speaking of the Euphrates, unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. And they brought presents, and they served Solomon all the days of his life. And Solomon's provisions for one day, 30 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 oxen out of the pasture, 100 sheep beside harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. He had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, speaking of the Euphrates. From Tephash even unto Azza, over all the kings on this side of the river, he had peace on all sides round about. Israel and Judah dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So, here was this, they were dwelling safely, everybody enjoying that, a picture of the millennium as it is. And it goes on, verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, exceeding much, largeness of heart, even as the sand on the seashore. His wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, and Calcol, and Darda, and the sons of Malah. His fame was in all nations round about. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. He spoke of trees, from the cedar tree in Lebanon to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. Spoke of beasts and fowl and creeping thing and fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. And Solomon just was tremendously noted for his insight, for his knowledge. As you go through and read in the book of Ecclesiastes, you read all the experiments. He built gardens. He concentrated on different things. And, of course, he proved by experience that the physical is not the ultimate satisfaction. Solomon got so caught up in all of those things in trying to, bring about the ultimate that, he missed the point. Finally, realized, wrote there in the end of Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole man. That's really what life is all about. But he had tremendous insight. This description of the millennium, every man under his vine and his fig tree, is given back in Micah 4:4. speaking of the world of moss. So this was describes here Hiram sending craftsmen down to, he had already discussed this with King David, and he sent craftsmen down to work for Solomon, and they hewed these stones and did all of these things. It was quite a remarkable thing. There's one interesting thing to note in verse 7 of 1Kings 6. The house, when it was in building, was built of stone, made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor tool of iron heard in the house which was in building. Now you talk about an unusual building project, an unusual construction site. It was a pretty quiet place. Instead of all these, shaping all these stones and everything, that was all done at the quarry. Now, obviously, they were very exact in their measurements, because they measured them out and they brought them down there and they fit. And people think, well, they were sort of primitive. How could they do that? Well, the pyramids were built a lot earlier than that. And those stones were pre-cut. They didn't cut them when they got up to the top of the pyramid to start trying to figure out and hammer it in. And those stones fit so well that they put together without mortar. But you couldn't put a penknife between the stones. And I'll tell you, you can't build very much. I don't know of any buildings built with stones without mortar that are going to last for 4,000 years. That is put up, so it doesn't mention about no mortar, but the stones were exactly cut. Now, why? You ever thought about why God had that? So many things are done as types. The temple is a type of something, right? In the New Testament, we're told that that we're the temple of God, that Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone, the prophets and the apostles are the foundation. Christ is the chief cornerstone. And, we're being built up as a holy temple unto the Lord. Peter adds another analogy. He brings out that Christ is the chief cornerstone, and what are we? We're living stones. Now, in ancient times, the cornerstone today is more, if you see a building, what's called the cornerstone is really more of a decorative thing. But the manner of building on something in ancient times was the cornerstone was cut and set, and everything was measured from the cornerstone. When they stretched the line, and this is the way that they use basically like a plumb bob in terms of getting things straight. Everything was measured in relation to the cornerstone. This was what was set, and the building was built out from that, and so its sides had to be exactly straight, because the building would be the line of the wall would be no straighter than the cornerstone. That was the means by which measurement was made. Everything was measured around that. Well, Christ is the chief cornerstone. So the spiritual temple means that everything is measured from Christ. We're living stones. Now, think about the analogy. The stones were prepared, brought to the site, and it all fit. Everything was pre-cut, and it all fit. When's, in that sense, the spiritual temple going to be assembled? Well, the spiritual temple isn't going to all be at the same place at the same time until the Mount of Olives, right? When all the righteous in the first resurrection be the first time that all of us have been, alive and present at the same place, same time. In that sense, the spiritual temple comes together. The stones have already been pre-cut. The Mount of Olives is not when Christ is going to get out the hammer and chisel and start trying to work away and get one of us squeezed into this spot and this other one, have to knock off a few things to get him squeezed into that one. We're getting the hammer and chisel used on us right now. That's what this life is all about. The stones are being pre-cut. It's interesting how God utilizes physical things to type spiritual reality. And you look in the New Testament, you read of certain things in the Old Testament, whether it's the building of the tabernacle and later the building of the temple. You read it then in the New Testament, and you see, well, there are spiritual lessons we derive from that, which is, I think, the reason why God had things done in a certain way, because there was a lesson He wanted us to draw, and this was the case here. One verse that is a key here in terms of chronology is 1Kings 6:1. Came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. This dates pretty well dates the Exodus. One thing I might mention, from the time of Solomon's reign on, the dates of it is possible to pretty well be exact about a lot of the Old Testament dates, and that is because there are corresponding secular sources where in some cases you have 2 or 3 things that will date. Several of the kings of Israel and Judah are mentioned by name in like Assyrian monuments and things like that, and some of those are in existence, which comes down and gives correlating dates, and so it enables us to sort of fit the story together. And this, of course, tells us exactly that 480 years, in the 480th year after the Exodus, is when Solomon began the temple. So that means then when you look at the book of Judges and you look at the events, you do a little bit of figuring. There were 40 years in the wilderness. Saul reigned 40 years and David reigned 40 years. That's 120 right off the top of this 480. That cuts you down to, let's say, approximately 360 years for the time from when Joshua entered the land on up until the time that Saul became king. And so that means the events of Joshua and Judges have to be fit into that 360-year, approximate 360-year period. So it gives us a reference. It's one of the ways we know that certain of the judges had to be contemporary, because we have, God gives us a few benchmark dates that enable us to, put things in a general time frame. You may argue about exactly the year. You could quibble here about a year. It was in the 480th year. Well, maybe does that mean like only 479 had passed and you were in the 480th? That's the sense of it. So you could maybe quibble about a year one way or the other. And there's several places where you could do that. God gives us enough information on chronology that you can come out to pretty well the general spot. There are a few things that are a little bit ambiguous to where it could make a difference of a few months or a difference of a year here or there, but it doesn't amount to a whole lot in the overall scheme of things. Describes here the temple that was built and the size of it, and one of the things I would call your attention to in verse 5 of 1Kings 6, against the walls of the house he built chambers round about. Against the walls of the house round about, both of the temple and the oracle, built chambers. And it describes these chambers. These are, when Christ talked about in my Father's house, referring to, the temple was on earth was the Father's house. You don't make my Father's house my Father's house to be a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves. He said, in my Father's house are many mansions, many places of abode, many chambers. Well, he was drawing on an analogy that all the people there were familiar with because they looked at the temple on a regular basis. And we often don't think about this or don't realize it, but it's described here, and there are a couple of other places that describe it, but actually there were 3 stories of apartments or rooms, chambers, not on the front of the temple, but on the 2 sides and the back, coming up for 3 stories, and some of those details are given, and those were assigned. Generally, they were assigned by office. There was one that was the high priest, and there was another that was the assistant high priest, and there were others that were the keeper of the door, and various offices. And so that understanding that background makes it more meaningful when Christ pointed out to the disciples, you see, in my Father's house are many mansions, many chambers. Okay, well, they understood that. Well, he was talking about let's say the spiritual reality, not the physical temple on earth, but the physical temple was, in that sense, patterned after something. God established the pattern, and the earthly patterns of the articles of furniture in the temple itself, right on down to the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, all of these were patterned after a heavenly reality, and they pointed to something. And there were spiritual things that can be learned, and other scriptures bring out. As we come on through the account, Solomon spent here. It describes the years building the temple, and it describes all of the things that were involved in that. And he was 7 years in building the temple, we're told in verse 38. Then building his own house, as we're told in chapter 7. He spent 13 years working on that. And all these building projects, this was what occupied a great deal of his time and attention for quite a while. It describes much of the various things concerning the temple. The dedication of the temple is brought out here in 1Kings chapter 8. We've looked at that at an earlier time in the sermon. This temple was dedicated at the feast. Mentions 1Kings 8:2. They assembled in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month, and they brought the ark in, dedicated the temple. God appeared to Solomon again at the dedication of the temple. After he had appeared to him when he was coronated as king. Now he appears again this time in 1Kings chapter 9, the second time, and after Solomon's prayer. Now, as we come on down here in the end of chapter 9, in verse 26, King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is beside Elat, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen that had knowledge of the sea, with the servants of Solomon. And they came to Ophir, fetched from thence gold, 420 talents, and brought it to King Solomon. And as we come on down in chapter 10, it talks a little more about the navy that Solomon put together. In verse 11, the navy of Hiram brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir a great plenty of almug trees and precious stones, and it goes on that with verse 22, the king had at sea a navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram. So he had two navies. Tarshish, he had one that was headquartered, the navy of Hiram was headquartered there at Elat on the Red Sea. The navy of Tarshish was there on the right near the Straits of Hercules, anciently called the Gibraltar, there on the Mediterranean coast of Spain, as the ancient location of Tarshish. So Solomon had a navy there on the Red Sea, and then he had one. He had a Mediterranean navy and an Indian Sea navy, and of course, I think there's certainly indication that his Navy, his Mediterranean Navy, or the Navy of Tarshish, I think it's very likely that they made trips all the way to the New World. But if you look on there, the only way to get from the Red Sea around into the Mediterranean before the Suez Canal was you had to go all the way around Africa. And when it describes this Navy of Solomon, these two navies, the Navy from Tarshish, verse 22, once in 3 years came the Navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. Now, 3 years is a long time to be at sea. In the 1500s, when Magellan circumnavigated the Earth, or his ship did. Magellan himself actually died in the Philippines. He didn't make it all the way back, but maybe 3 years. One interesting thing on that puzzled people for years afterward, several years. On Magellan's ship, they kept the ship log, and they kept it every day, filled in the ship log. When they got back to Spain, after having been gone 3 years, they were 1 day off from the date in Spain. And they were adamant that they had kept the ship log every day. There was no way they could be in error. And the people in Spain we certainly haven't lost a day in the last 3 years. We kept up with it. And it was a number of years before somebody figured out, and it was just a matter of thinking about it as you laid out, realized, well, it's round, 360 degrees. It was a long time before anybody figured out about the international date line but they proved that. They went all the way around 3 years, and they came back, and they were a day off, and they could not figure out how they could be a day off. And interesting. Some of those things are still sort of brain teasers, aren't they? And that's right. But this clearly Solomon's navy went far afield, because ivory, apes, peacocks, the ivory. You're clearly talking about. Had to go at least as far as India, and if you left from Tarshish, the only way to get there would have been to go around. The shortest way from Tarshish would have been to have gone all the way around Africa. So it was, quite a thing. Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and wisdom, verse 23. And all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And they brought every man his present, vessels of silver and gold and garments and armor and spices and horses and mules, a rate year by year. And just incredible, the wealth that came flowing in. Solomon had a worldwide impact. People all over, he was trading throughout throughout the world. And it's an interesting thing. The Queen of Sheba came to prove Solomon with hard questions, and she makes an interesting comment in verse 7 and 8. She told him in verse 6, she said, I heard all these stories about you, and I didn't believe it. Now I've seen it, and I realize that far from being an exaggeration, what I heard really wasn't even as great as reality. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame which I heard. Verse 8, happy are your men, happy are these your servants, which stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. She noticed that people were happy. Now, we read at the very beginning of Solomon's reign, we read that people were eating and drinking and making merry. When things were on track, there was peace, there was prosperity, and there was happiness. People were happy. And that was one of the things that impressed her, was not only the wealth of Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, but just the whole atmosphere there. Well, the problem, of course, that, you find in terms of how prosperous things were, in chapter 10, verse 27 says, the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones. I mean, it was, silver became so plentiful that it just almost lost its value. And he had this, Solomon had all these great things that were built, these targets of these shields of beaten gold and all of these tremendous things that were there. His drinking vessels were all of pure gold, and we're told in verse 21 that the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. None were of silver. It was accounted nothing in the days of Solomon. It was just, he just was fabulously wealthy. And but the problem, of course, was after Solomon had gotten his building projects finished, he got another project started that was not a good project. Chapter 11, verse 1. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. Of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, don't go into them, neither shall they come into you. They'll turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clave to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. 1,000 women. Now, he was the king, and he did everything on a grand scale. Well, the result was, verse 4, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. His heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And he went after Ashtaroth, the god of the Zidonians. And verse 6, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, went not fully after the Lord. Verse 7, he built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and the hill that's before Jerusalem. Verse 8, likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burn incense and sacrifice to their gods. They began to whine and complain, and they wanted this and that, and he did it for one, and then the others, they needed one too, and so he did it for them, and just, he had a mess is what he had, and it was, we have that laid out. As we come on down through the story, we find that God told Solomon that he was going to rend the kingdom from him. He's not going to do it during his lifetime, but he would do it. And he would retain only Judah and Jerusalem there for his son. Adversaries began to be stirred up, and that was certain problems and things that began to occur. And we find the story here of Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's, capable young man that Solomon used in a high office, and he was chosen to be the king of Israel, not over Judah, but over Israel. And evidently Solomon, we're told of Jeroboam in verse 28 of chapter 11, that he was a mighty man of valor. Solomon, seeing the young man, he was industrious, made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. And word must have gotten back to Solomon that Jeroboam had been told that he would be king after Solomon's death, because Solomon made an outlaw out of him, began to put a price on his head, and Jeroboam fled to Egypt and waited down there until after Solomon died. And of course Solomon did die and reigned the 40 years, and as we're told in verse 42 of 1Kings 11, the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, and Rehoboam reigned in his stead. Next Bible study, we will pick up the story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and also some of the immediate successor kings. But there's an awful lot that is here in terms of what we see of this period of history, and that set a pattern, with the temple, with the greatness of the kingdom under David and Solomon. But Righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. And that's over and over what seemingly people couldn't get through their head, that the only way to real success in the long term is righteousness. And there's so many things to distract and get people's attention off the wrong way. And that's what happened to Solomon. Well, with that, we will be concluded, and I'll pass out questions for next time. Good night.